All right, we're trying something a little bit different today. I'm teaming up with Sean McVeigh from Sean's Outdoor Adventures.
What's up, everybody?
Turns out we have very similar hunting styles and YouTube channels, so if you like my videos, you probably like his and vice versa. We're gonna have 5 tips posted in this video, and then we'll have 5 more tips posted over on Sean's channel, so I'll have a link to that video in the description down below, and probably an annotation if you're watching on a desktop. The first tip I want to give in regards to hunting public land is that hunter pressure is absolutely critical. We often hear and read in articles that in order to hunt public land, you got to go in deep, you got to get your boots wet, you got to go in X amount of miles away from the road, and then you get away from everybody else. Well, let me tell you something, I hunt a lot of public land around the heavily hunted Twin Cities metro area, and the only thing that getting your boots wet is going to guarantee you is that you're going to get away from a lot of squirrel hunters. There's lots of guys that are hardcore nowadays. There's lots of guys that are using the internet and figuring this stuff out, and they're going in deep. So more than ever, it's really important to find the areas that the deer still feel safe. It might not be that area that's 3 miles away from the road, but once you find those pockets, those kind of hidden pockets that everybody else is missing, that's where you're gonna start finding the deer sign. Let me give you an example of this. About maybe 7 or 8 years ago, my dad and I were hunting this area of public land that was basically a parking lot surrounded by a large area of hardwoods, and those hardwoods are surrounded by an even larger area of cattail marsh. Lots of cattails, lots of red brush, islands, and that's where we were focusing most of our time in the early season, was hunting out in the islands and the transition areas and the cattails. And a lot of the other guys that were hunting that same area were doing the same thing, but there would always be like the 1 or 2 guys that would hunt closer to the parking lot, just in the regular hardwoods. And I remember we came back after a sit early November. We hadn't seen anything, but we were talking to these guys that were hunting in the hardwoods, and they were seeing more deer than we were. So we took that as a sign that maybe all this pressure out in the cattail marsh was pushing especially the does into the hardwoods where they felt safer, and since it was early November, that was bringing the bucks in as well. So we started for the rest of that week just hunting in the hardwoods, probably a maximum of a half a mile away from the vehicle. And we started seeing deer every sit. One of those sits, I remember my daddy saw, I think it was 8 or 9 deer, had a 6-pointer bed down right underneath him, and then he had a big, what he described as like a 150 class 12-pointer that he just couldn't get a shot at. So it just goes to show you that even though the general rule of thumb for public land is that you're supposed to get in deep and get away from all the pressure, sometimes getting away from all the pressure is actually getting closer to the vehicle, which is the opposite of what you might expect.
Tip number 2. Now, hunting public land, I'm sure you've probably seen reflector tacks going through the woods. If you wanted to, you could follow those tacks right to the person's spot and set up there yourself if you wanted. I like to keep my spots as secret as possible to keep the amount of pressure in those areas as low as possible. Therefore, I use a handheld GPS for everything. I'll go in, pick out my tree stand locations, put it in here, and leave no sign that I've been there. And that's a tip I would encourage you to incorporate. There's a lot of smartphones nowadays that will enable you to do the same thing. So rather than put up reflector tacks and tell everybody exactly where you're going to be, maybe consider using one of these and practice with it in advance to make sure you know how it works so that you don't get messed up the first time you use a GPS and then you can't find your spot again. So get a little practice with it too.
Tip number 3 is to really take some effort to ensure that you have the right entry route into your tree. It might not matter quite as much in the rut when deer movement could be coming from anywhere, but any other time of the year when you're on a bedding and feeding pattern, it can be absolutely critical. As an example, let's say it's an afternoon sit in a cattail marsh. I might anticipate that a deer is going to be bedded in a certain location, so whatever route that I take, I'm going to make sure that I'm never at any point upwind of that deer's bed, even if my actual tree stand location is not upwind of the bed. The reason for that is if that deer so much as smells me at any point along that entry route, it just might make him nervous enough to not leave the safety of his bed until after dark. And at that point, it didn't matter how good my setup was. Another example, let's say it's early morning in hill country. The parking lot is up high with all the agriculture, and then the land drains down into a river bottom. Now, the easiest thing to do would be to park up where the parking lot is and just walk on the flat land along the edges of the agriculture, get to the woods, and then set up in anticipation of that deer coming back from feeding and into his bed. Well, the only problem with that is you're basically walking along some of the exact same routes that that deer could take to get back to his bed. So in a case like that, even though it might be more work, you'd be a lot better off accessing from the river, taking a canoe or a kayak or a small boat, and then coming up through the ravines and then setting up. In addition, until the sun really rises and heats up the valley floors, those thermals are going to be dropping scent from high elevation down to low elevation. So not only do you have the advantage of not getting your scent along the trails a deer could take to get back to his bed, but you've also got the thermals in your favor.
Tip number 4, and this is especially if you're traveling a distance to hunt new spots, new public land. Like me, I hunt in different states, and I'm not there very much, so I talk to everybody. If I see a hunter walking in or out of the woods the same time I am, I walk right over to him and start chatting and just see what kind of information I can gain. A lot of times these same people, they'll put their head down and start walking away. It's like people are afraid to talk to you, but I'm encouraging you. Don't be afraid to talk to people and gain information. I also like to go into local restaurants and places like that and just start talking to people. Hey, I'm thinking of hunting in this area this year. Do you got any tips for me? You got any insight? I look for people wearing camo and say, hey, do you hunt? Me too. I'm checking this spot out this year. I'm going to do any hunting. You can point me in a direction. And I always listen to everything they say. And of course, I try to detect if they're pointing me in the wrong direction too. But there's a lot of times you can pick up great information doing that.
Tip number 5 would be to learn to leverage the full power of the internet. And I'm not just talking about online mapping and scouting. I have videos on those. Those are all great. But I'm also referring to becoming a part of an online community that'll help you to learn faster than you'd be able to learn on your own. I'm an active member on probably 3 or 4 outdoor forums. They're all large enough that they have a really nice knowledge base, but at the same time they're still small enough that they don't have a bunch of egos arguing on every other thread, and everybody still maintains a pretty open mind. And on a forum like that, it doesn't matter if somebody who's just starting out is asking a really basic question, or if somebody who's been hunting for decades has a question that's really specific based on one little thing that they noticed with deer observation. You can still stand to learn something from all that collective experience. One thing I've learned about online forums like that is that the more that you help out and make yourself feel as if you're part of the community, the more willing people will be to help you out in return. So let's say you join an elk hunting forum, and as your first post you say, going out to Unit 67 this fall, what do you guys think? You're probably not going to get a lot of feedback on that post because, for one, it's a topic that anybody who does hunt that unit is going to be kind of reluctant to release information about. And secondly, it looks like you just joined that post only to ask the question, and you're probably doing it on a dozen other websites. Conversely, if you're to join the forum and start asking questions about elk behavior certain times a year, certain elevations, certain types of terrain that you plan on hunting, if you start posting congratulations on other people's success stories, if you start providing input on other questions you might have knowledge about and make yourself feel as if you're part of the community, people are going to be a lot more willing to answer the questions that you have, especially if you show an appreciation for that knowledge and a willingness to learn. I gave that example for an elk hunting forum, but that's going to hold true for a deer hunting forum, archery forum, pretty much any kind of online community that you could hope to learn from. Hope those tips were helpful for you guys. Make sure to check out the other 5 at Sean's Outdoor Adventures.